It's been a while since I've done another game design deep dive video, but since I'm knee deep in Metroidvanias and working on my next book, I figure this is a good time to talk about the most confusing yet very definable subgenre of Metroidvanias. Why it's grown so popular, what are some great games to study, both good and bad, and why we all just love to double jump. If there was ever an award for most confusing genre when it comes to the game industry, Metroidvania may take that home. Although, it may be tied between what is a roguelike and what is a Metroidvania. But the subgenre has existed now for over 30 years, we could say, if we go really far back searching that definition. While many people, of course, will assume it is a combination of Metroid and Castlevania, the hardcore fans know that the original inspiration, defined by Igarashi, was to do a combination of Metroid and Legend of Zelda. Although I guess Metrink, Megelda doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well. But following the tremendous, and I do mean tremendous, success of Symphony of the Night, the genre in the 2000s was defined pretty much by Castlevania and Metroid. While there have been few examples in the 90s through the 2000s from either AA or indie developers, such as, of course, Cave Story and Aquaria, what we kind of define as Metroidvania design, the genre's explosion, didn't really occur until the 2010s. Specifically after 2013, when Konami decided to get out of the whole kind of console PC market to focus on gambling and mobile games, which, as we all know, did incredibly well for them. Nevertheless, what makes Metroidvania design so challenging to talk about is that a lot of people are confused by what it means. Some will, of course, define this as an elevated action-adventure game. Some may throw in puzzles, or they'll say it's some kind of mix of anything. If you have any kind of upgrade to your game as a Metroidvania. But the differences between a bad, good, and amazing example of Metroidvania design are very vast. And it's important to discuss the kind of hard definitions or qualifications of a Metroidvania. A Metroidvania must have character progression, as in the character the player is controlling must be upgraded or grow over the course of playing. Now, this is typically, again, done using reflex-driven abilities, so new movement tech, new action abilities, new combat moves, etc., etc. Now, again, when we talk about things along those lines, it is very easy to find a Metroidvania just about any action-adventure game. Everyone from the likes of Zelda to Rygar to even like 3D platformers like Jak and Daxter, Spyro, and so on feature upgrades. You get some new power, a new suit, costume, gem color that changes your character. But the other definition, what really narrows down Metroidvania design, is that the level design and the world design of the game must grow and change as the player progresses through the game. It must be legitimately different to walk, jump, run, dash, whatever, 5 minutes into the game versus 5 hours, 10 hours, and so on. And this is where we see kind of the differences between Metroidvania design and other action-adventure games. Most action-adventure games will either focus on like a stage-based progression, you go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, or their world design is just basically like this. You're going from point A to point B. There's no reason to explore this chunk once you're finished with it because there's no secrets, there's no reason to backtrack. So you go to the next one, and the next one, and rinse and repeat. But when we talk about good Metroidvania design, it's about exploring an entire world, having a reason to replay and revisit areas, and more importantly, being able to revisit them in a different way. Running through the early areas in Hollow Knight without being able to do wall climbing, double jump, or air dash is a very different experience once you get those abilities. And it provides these level designs a lot more depth to them, rather than just being this straight line from beginning to end. What makes this very challenging is that as the genre has grown in the 2010s, there's now even subgenres to the subgenre. Some people now use terms like Roguevania, OGVania, Metroidbrainia. I think there's a few more Vanias. There's a Maniavania going on. And on one hand, it's great that the genre can flourish in so many ways, but it also makes it very tricky to kind of nail down what makes a Metroidvania and why so many people love to make them today. And I'll be going over the good and bad examples in the second part of this video that we'll be switching over to in a few minutes. The kind of rise of Metroidvania design from the likes of Cave Story, Aquaria, to what we see today with Bloodstain, Ghost Song, Pharaoh Plus. Again, I have an entire list. Robot Named Fight, Dead Cells, that little known game. And what we've seen is that there's lots of different ways of focusing on Metroidvania design. You can promote things as more of a shooter experience and unlocking double jump or other movement tech like we see with Metroid Prime. You can go for more of a roguelike experience, again with stuff like Robot Named Fight and Dead Cells. There's meta progression. Even the act of meta progression in some of these games could kind of finagle itself into the Metroidvania genre. When I was talking a few minutes about how the 90s and early 2000s was dominated by Metroid and Castlevania, there are other games that technically had Metroidvania adjacent elements to it. Stuff like Gargoyle's Quest, Demon's Crest, even the Mega Man X series technically has permanent upgrades that change how you move around. The first time you get the ability to dash really transforms how you do movement tech in Mega Man X. But again, if the level design is not set up to accommodate and provide different ways of exploring, then all the upgrades in the world are not really changing things. Kaizo games would certainly not be an example of Metroidvania design because there's only one way to get through it. The, most best and optimal way, but still only one way. Another trap that we'll talk about in the next part is the differences between keys versus tools when it comes to Metroidvania design. A key is an ability that can only be used to unlock a specific obstacle or get past one specific function. So if you have something that's called the all-devouring flame of death, and it's only used to open red doors, doesn't really do all that much. But if you have a power, let's say you shoot a fire blast, it can burn through wood and grass, does damage to enemies, and can propel the character while they're in the air. That's 3 different utility uses that can then be used in level and environmental design. That's what you kind of want to see in a good Metroidvania. You want each ability to have a punch to it. That's not just, okay, this opens a door. This gets past the green wall. You want each ability to be ideally used for both movement and combat, but at least used for one of those functions that can grow and persist across the entire game. A bad combat ability would be something that just counters one specific enemy. Now you can break through yellow shields. Now you can fight blue enemies. A good example that we'll talk about in the next part will be something like Guacamelee that integrates both combat and movement almost completely into its wrestling moves. Now before we move on, one final point before we get to our game examples. Why did so many developers chase Metroidvania design over the 2010s? Why, for those of you watching this video, you're probably thinking about making a Metroidvania. Metroidvania design is very advanced. This is a combination of different genres and different degrees of level design and environmental design. When it works, it can be a massive boost to a studio and to a developer to make one of these games pop. As we've seen with the likes again of Cave Story, La Mulana, Dead Cells, and even stuff like Blasphemous, and there's another one I'm forgetting off the top of my head, which I'm sure we'll bring up in the next part of this video. So many developers label their games as Metroidvania just as they label their games as Souls-likes. Your game is a little bit hard. It's a Souls-like. Your game has an upgrade. It's a Metroidvania. which is also kind of the whole Soulsvania or Souls-like Metroidvania style began. But this is a very hard genre to work in. I wouldn't say it's as hard as learning platforming and shooters, as those genres at this point are kind of razor honed or laser focused in terms of what you need to do and why the bar has been raised so high. However, one of the biggest traps you can fall into when designing a Metroidvania is thinking, well, I don't need to worry about platforming or making a good combat. Everything working together will lift it up. Just as with a roguelike and how procedural generation will not save a bad game, Metroidvania design will not save a bad platform or a bad shooter or an action game or a Souls-like or a puzzle game or anything else that you can imagine. And it's very easy to make these games feel bad or to introduce problems that will then later be solved. And trust me, that point will come up quite a bit in the next section. The best examples of Metroidvania design are fantastic platformers or fantastic action-adventure games that, again, are then layered upon with additional mechanics, progression, and level design. If you can't build your game as kind of like this, again, just putting layer on top of layer on top of layer of each other, then you're just going to end up with a platformer or an action game, which again is not a bad thing. But if you're promoting your game as a Metroidvania, there's kind of a problem with that. So, it's time to get to the bulk of today's video, as we're going to be talking about good, bad, and major examples that you should be studying if you want to learn how to make a Metroidvania for yourself. Normally in these design dives, I try to avoid the major examples because they're already well known. But with Metroidvania, we do need to, of course, give homage, and it is worth studying our two kind of progenitors to the genre with Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, as we're beginning with kind of a double do. Both games still hold up fantastically, not only as classic retro games, but as amazing Metroidvanias. With Super Metroid, you're going to learn about how to do very advanced movement tech, and more importantly, how that can be factored into sequence breaking. Something that has become very huge among kind of the Kaizo and speedrunning communities, and this idea again of adding in advanced elements that the game is not balanced or built on, but still allow someone to do more within the space. This leads to, again, more advanced maneuvers, and it does a great job of rewarding the player in that respect. Now, with both games, you're also going to get the kind of MO of progression when it comes to Metroidvanias, and why these two games have been the blueprints for the genre for, well, a whole lot of years at this point. Now, Symphony of the Night is worth citing as kind of more on the RPG side of Metroidvanias, again, the whole OGVania style. This notion that you can have gear, you can level up. This is also the game that introduced, of course, double jumping, while Super Metroid kind of did the infinite jump. Symphony of the Night is a fantastic game, really great use of aesthetics, and is also a fantastic example of elevating the entire Metroidvania design. Because this is the game that kind of restructured Castlevania as an entire franchise for years to come. And why this one worked so well was by giving the player so much more than could they ever expect out of this particular design. The ability to explore a fully realized castle, the different upgrades you get, the secret ending where you have to, of course, go down or reverse things to get to the true ending. All this adds up to an experience that really was captivating when it was first introduced. Again, it is such a watershed moment for the genre, and why the whole Metroidvania thing stuck, even though, again, that Igarashi was inspired by Zelda. With both of these games, you're going to get, again, the basic elements of Metroidvania design. Now, with that said, as we're going to be talking about throughout this video, there are plenty of examples of games that have done things differently, better, or more uniquely than these two, but this is a fantastic way to get going. I was originally going to ignore or push some of the larger examples until later in this video to build suspense, and while there's still going to be one major example of that, it's important to, when studying Metroidvania design, to understand that there is kind of three essential cores that a developer can focus on, and they are going to be movement, combat, and exploration. So this next kind of mini section, or larger section I should say, is going to talk about some of the apex examples of this, because this is going to infer on a lot of the choices you're going to see throughout this video, as each one of the games we've mentioned is going to have kind of a major aspect of either one, two, or all three of them. And this is incredibly important to understand when you're building your own Metroidvania, in terms of what you want to focus on and kind of build your foundation on before kind of adding on and layering additional mechanics and systems. So let's start with movement. And one of the best examples of movement and feel in a Metroidvania is the Ori series. So Ori is a game that, again, when you're watching footage of it, you will see, of course, combat, you will see exploration, but it's really built on the concept or on the foundation of great platformer and movement tech. It is a joy to move from point A to point B in this game. And this is something that can only happen when you build your game around multiple maneuvers, different kinds of tech, jumping, dashing, and all that. And it's about letting the player explore the space in terms of momentum. How do I get from point A to point B to point C, etc.? And the challenge in this game is all predicated on that. You have to figure out how to best use your moveset if you won't have any attempt of getting through things. While combat is an aspect of this game, this is not a combat-centric Metroidvania by any means, and we'll be talking about plenty of those examples throughout this video. What you'll get out of playing the Ori games is, again, the importance of feel. Like I said earlier with Super Metroid, making the act of moving enjoyable is exceptionally hard if you don't have a background playing platformers, action games, anything that is reflex driven. And Ori does a fantastic job of, again, making it feel great to walk and jump at the beginning, to then layer on additional powers, additional tech, the kind of like reflect or bounce yourself off of projectiles power, and so on and so forth. When the feel of a game is off, you will, well, pun intended, feel that all the way through. And it's one of the major reasons why so many people will churn or get out of a game if that initial walk, that initial jump is clunky, it's unresponsive, it doesn't feel right. And Ori is just a fantastic way to get that sense of feel. And if you can make your game as enjoyable as Ori, you've kind of won a few of the harder battles already. Now, if the movement-focused Metroidvania is about the joy of walking from left to right, combat-centric Metroidvanias are about the joy of, well, punching the you-know-what out of whatever gets in your way. We've seen this uptick of combat-focused Metroidvanias over the last few years, and several of them are going to be popping up later in this video. But when I think about one of the best examples of this, my mind goes to Guacamelee, or the Guacamelee series. What Guacamelee does is that if Ori was about integrating movement tech into all kinds of platforming and jumping and exploration, Guacamelee is about integrating combat into all facets of the game. To wit, your different combos or special moves also act as your movement upgrades. So your ground pound that lets you smash enemies from above is also used to break through breakable platforms. Your super uppercut that launches enemies is also your double jump. And this game also shows off one of the major aspects of a combat-centric Metroidvania with the use of a variety of arenas to let the player test, hone, and just experiment with the combat. This is also one of the few, even in terms of combat Metroidvanias, that has a kind of combo-based system, that it rewards you based on how much you mix up your moves, how well you avoid taking damage, with a higher combo meter, which gets you more rewards, and of course, more bragging rights along the way. I love the art and the aesthetic of kind of this Day of the Dead theme, with Guacamelee and the whole, I think it turns into the Mexoverse when you get into the second game. And it's also, as another interesting, unique aspect of this game, one of the few Metroidvanias that is built on co-op. The second one, I think, has up to 4-player co-op, which in some respect makes the game easier because only one person needs to get through the platforming in order to solve it for everyone else. The use of kind of fighting game or action game mechanics, such as using mix-ups, kind of transitioning from ground to aerial moves and back again, and even interrupting your own attacks with special moves, is another very interesting aspect of this kind of combat-centric design. We'll be talking about kind of the Soulsvania later in this video, but what Guacamelee does is that it approaches its combat as an action game to then add on the Metroidvania designs and elements to it. While there are tricky platforming and kind of movement tech in that respect, it's not as much of the star of the show as it is just beating up all these different enemies. And it's a very tough line to walk. If you make the enemies too challenging or too frustrating, it completely slows the game down. If the combat is too easy, then all the moves and abilities you give the player don't necessarily matter. And Guacamelee strikes a very healthy balance in that respect. And this one is going to be worth studying if you're looking for a little bit more punching and oomphy to go with your Metroidvania. The exploration angle of Metroidvania is about the sense of mystery, trying to go around the world looking for where's the next route, where's that next upgrade. And this gets at sometimes more on the puzzling side, such as environmental puzzles, or in our next example, just some brain-melty ones. And the king of exploration when it comes to Metroidvania design is the La Mulana series. La Mulana is a franchise that's something that, for those of you watching this right now, you either are very well acquainted with, or you have no idea what these games are. La Mulana's challenge is about exploring a hidden temple full of traps, exceedingly more traps, spikes, more traps, and lots of puzzles. And what the game does really well is it gets at the dopamine of upgrades and making progress. This is a game that you are going to fight for every single good thing or every improvement that you will find in the game. And there are a multitude of passive upgrades, some that simply act as keys, while others are more quality of life. And of course, double jumping is in there. But while there is combat and movement in La Mulana, the key focus is on solving the myriad of puzzles. And this is the game's both its strength and its weakness, because the puzzles here are advanced. There are some puzzles in this game that will make an adventure game fan kind of like get confused as to what the solution is. And for those of you watching this, I did finally end up beating La Mulana 1, but I really resorted to a hint guide to get through this. The joy of playing this game is kind of understanding and finding all these items. And the puzzles do a great job providing that dopamine, kind of similar to that of the Zelda franchise. When you see a treasure chest, in La Mulana's case a blue treasure chest, you know there's something fantastic in that chest. They will never hide like, here's just a few coins, or here's some worthless MacGuffin. Every single blue chest in this game has a vital tool for you to use. How you get that chest open, however, greatly differs and varies based on the area and the puzzle you're solving. This is a game that, quite frankly, there are puzzles that the actual puzzle itself is in one area, the key to that puzzle's in another area, the clues to solving where the key is to the puzzle or in a completely different area, and you're going to try and make sense out of all of that. And if you want to see this game all the way through, my goodness, there are some very devious puzzles. And I still am very unsure if anyone has managed to beat either game without resorting to a hint guide at some point during the play of it. Studying Loopavania is all about, again, the sense of exploration and wonder. This idea that the world is open to the player. Some Metroidvanias are far more stricter than that, some are far looser. But it's about this idea that I can go and explore. That maybe this one item that I found over here will then let me go over there, which will then open up this door, which will open up a switch, which will then let me get to some new fancy schmancy place. And when I do that, things change. And Loopavania, as I said in the first part, is one of the best examples, as with the other games that we've mentioned in the kind of top 3 here, about how much the game changes in terms of the player's way of going through it from beginning to middle to end. Because of the myriad of upgrades in Loopavania, you do get that sense of growth. What you do in the very first area of the game is completely alien to how it plays near the very end, and the game will challenge you in every respect. The reason why I don't put this in the don't column is because of the fact that it is such a very fine-tuned game, but the puzzle design, as I said, is very extreme. And for most of you reading this, if you are designing your own Metroidvania, you are more than likely not going to go for this level of puzzle complexity. What makes it very difficult to parse is that every puzzle is essentially a one-off. This is not a case like a Zelda game, or like some of our other titles, where how you solve one puzzle will infer the next puzzle. That the maneuver that you use on puzzle A will help you with puzzle B, and then puzzle C is a growth of puzzle B, and you get the picture. Because of the logic and the world being used here, how you solve puzzle A has no bearing on puzzle B, and puzzle D is its own unique thing, and while puzzle Z is going to just make your head explode in terms of complexity. And people that will like that. There are puzzle fans who love that kind of style. But if you're trying to approach Loopavania as a straightforward Metroidvania like any other game mentioned on this list or that's out there, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. Nevertheless, this is an incredibly original, very unique, and very challenging game that is certainly worth studying again for that drive of exploration. And as I said, just the sheer act of making it rewarding to go from room to room. A lot of lesser Metroidvanias tend to fail on that, when the upgrades are spaced out too far, or the reward at the end of a tough room or a tough section is maybe just, here's $50. Here's one part of the 7-piece health orb that you need in order to get one more tick of health, or one more line of spell casting. In Loopavania, when you get that new health upgrade, or you get that new item, it is a joyous occasion. And getting the player to feel that way for every single upgrade is another very hard task, because it requires you once again to understand what it's like to play your game at the very start, how do you improve on that, and what do you introduce to make things better from beginning to middle to end. And if you can get that sense of pacing done, then much like with the previous example with Guacamelee, with making the feel good, then you are really along the way to making a fantastic Metroidvania. We had a double do earlier, so it's time for a rare double don't, with games that tried to hide the fix, or use progression as a way of fixing issues with their games. And the two examples I want to talk about are Afterimage and Astalon Tears of the Earth. Now, the point of Metroidvania progression is, again, this idea of drip feeding upgrades. The player is getting better, the game is getting better from beginning to middle to end. But the problem that both of these games have is that they begin with glaring issues or faults from the player's perspective to then only fix them using upgrades. And they both have a very unusual issue with this. In Afterimage, this is a combat-centric Metroidvania, and when the game was first launched, they had this point where you have to go down once you get to kind of the opening castle to fight the first boss in order to unlock dashing. Now, on paper that doesn't sound bad, but you see, dash is your sole defensive maneuver. So, for people who started this game, they found that, well, they couldn't really avoid a lot of damage. Your character really didn't jump high, and enemies who attack like multiple times or attack fast, you didn't necessarily have the means to get around them. And this led to combat being very frustrating. So it annoyed a lot of people, and deservedly so. With the first content patch, the developers gave the player the dash right from the beginning. Now this actually introduced an unusual problem, because the dash was there to gate your access into the castle. So if you start with a dash, you can just sequence break the entire first kind of dungeon of the game because of it. Now that's not like a huge damning issue, but again it shows some of the trickiness of Metroidvania design, and how if one thing goes out of alignment with your progression model, your upgrades, it can mess with everything else that goes with it. Now, Astalon went with a very unique aspect in terms of having this character swapping, and I know there's a lot of people who don't like character swapping mechanics because it tends to slow things down, as we've been seeing with playing Donkey Kong 64 on the stream. And what Astalon did was it built character swapping into the progression level design. So for the first quarter of the game, the whole notion is that you go forward with the character, open up a shortcut or some kind of switch, to then go back to the checkpoint, swap characters, use them to go further, and rinse and repeat as you kind of leapfrog ahead. But it was very slow and very cumbersome to do. So developers introduced an upgrade that you can get relatively early in the game, you know where it is, to have instant character swapping, and that makes the game a world better. However, a lot of people didn't see that upgrade. They saw a very frustrating system, they felt that's how the game is going to be, and they, well, quit. And this is the issue when it comes to having or knowingly having pain points or issues with your game to try and fix with the progression. Some players will not see it that way. They'll say there's a problem, they'll think that you didn't solve or you didn't know what it was, and they're going to quit. Most people will do that when they run into frustration. This is a very similar issue that we see with games that hide fast travel behind like some kind of gate or very far into the game. I could probably add a few bonus notes for this section in that respect. The point that you should be understanding is that progression in Metroidvania is about making the game better. It's not about fixing the game. If your game needs to be fixed using upgrades, then there is a very big problem. Because again, most people are not going to wait for that fix. They're not going to assume you have that fix. They're just going to quit, be frustrated, and never try your game again. We have another double do for our next category, and these are stage-based Metroidvanias. Typically when we talk about Metroidvania design, it is meant to be an open world or kind of quasi-non-linear, and the bulk of the games in today's videos are going to be of that style. But there is a way of doing a smaller, or should I say quote-unquote, smaller scale Metroidvania using stages, where instead of you going to multiple areas, each stage will oftentimes have multiple routes. You won't be able to access every route on your first play, but you'll gain upgrades that will allow you to revisit levels, take a new route, get a new upgrade, go to another route, and continue the progression along those lines. While this is not as elevated a take on the Metroidvania formula as some of the other games on our do list for this video, it's still a kind of great way to get your feet wet in terms of designing a Metroidvania before you go all in on the level and world design of the larger examples. So the two that I want to mention first is Pharaoh Rebirth Plus. This was a kind of smaller scale indie game that we played, And it was recommended to me, I'm glad that they did, as this is a fantastic take on the stage-based Metroidvania. Each level will have at least 2 routes to go through. There is a lot of upgrades, both passive and active, to pick up, and the movement tech does evolve over the course of playing. Now, this is probably one of the shortest Metroidvanias on our list, as it's all going to be built around the different stages. It can be a little bit on the difficult side in terms of combat. This is more, I would say, action platformer than your kind of traditional action or some of the other combat-centric Metroidvanias we'll talk about. But still, really great kind of like textbook example on stage-based Metroidvania design. Now, the second one is probably the most elevated take on the stage-based Metroidvania, and that is, of course, the Messenger. As I said with some of the previous examples, what makes Metroidvania design so great is that it can really elevate a design as a whole when it is done properly. And here with the Messenger, it is certainly done just that. Really great story, some hilarious writing as well, and its own unique style with the shifting between the 8 and 16-bit aesthetics, all while again perfectly encapsulating stage-based Metroidvania design and progression. You'll get new abilities, you'll be able to return to previous routes, get more stuff. And again, when it comes to stage-based design, it still is limited in terms of what you can really do with all of it. But The Messenger and Pharaoh Plus Rebirth are both amazing examples of this format. And like I said, if you are someone who's interested in 2D design and Metroidvania, but you don't want to commit to a larger scale progress, then this is a great way to begin this first step. Now, when it comes to different takes on Metroidvania design, specifically ones that aren't focused on 2D platforming, they are rare, but they do exist. And our next couple of examples are going to be of that specific category, starting with MF01 Aerostrike. This was an indie game that we tried a few years ago, and similar to that of the Aquatic Adventures of the Last Human, this is a ship-based Metroidvania, where you will fly, bullet hell, and do all the shmupping, along with getting upgrades and trying to explore the space. Now, this one I would say may be limited in terms of the aesthetics, as you're seeing from the footage, but it does show off a really good example of how you can do the Metroidvania format and not involve jumping, and more specifically, not involve double jumping as well. Because it is a very interesting task when you're trying to build a Metroidvania and not using kind of the quote-unquote essential upgrades that everyone knows and loves. So if you're looking for more of a shmup-based Metroidvania, and there are a few other ones out there, but I think this one best encapsulates that along with the Metroidvania progression. Now, with another example of a very original Metroidvania, we go to Yoku's Island Express. This is a pinball-vania, and it does this once again by adapting many of the pinball physics and strategies, but scaling this up into an open-world Metroidvania design. You'll explore this island using flippers, bumpers, avoiding drains, while collecting lots of fruit that you will need to unlock various services, shortcuts, and events. Upgrades both come in the form of new ways of exploring the basic world, as well as unlocking new features for the various pinball areas. This one is a very interesting take. While it may look very light and breezy, it can get on the challenging side, and if you are not good at pinball, this is certainly not going to be the game to try out. But I hope you're noticing this pattern of Metroidvania design that is used to elevate a pre-existing or another genre. And Yoku is definitely another example of this. And there are a few other pinball-vanias that have come out since, but I feel like this one is the most approachable in terms of its design, as well as the kind of format for the island chain. So, again, if you like pinballs, Metroids, and islands, then this is another fantastic one to check out. Our next original take on Metroidvania design takes us to what some people have described as a Metroidbrainia, a Metroidvania that focuses on puzzle design. And while I'm not quite sold on the distinction just yet, our next game is a very strong contender for that, with Isles of Sea and Sky. This is, once again, an elevated take on the Soulsvania style of puzzle design, but combining that both with Metroidvania aspects and the idea of a kind of Zelda exploration. You are exploring a vast world, solving Soulsvania puzzles in order to get the resource to unlock the next area. Where the Metroidvania aspects come in is as you kind of rescue or meet the various gods of the Isles, you will be able to unlock new functionality. They will unlock kind of a new mechanic that will allow you to revisit a puzzle and solve it a different way, either granting you access to a new path or to new resources. And of course, as the game goes on, these mechanics will start to combine, and it will start to get very topsy-turvy if you're not good at Soulsvania. Another fantastic example of using the pacing and progression of Metroidvania not only to elevate the design as a whole, but also provide a solid use of onboarding. The very starting puzzles of this game should be very familiar to anyone who has ever played a Soulsvania style game, but it does a great way of easing you in until it kind of takes the gloves off when you have to start interacting with the various kind of god mechanics. Very fantastic in terms of art and aesthetics as well. And again, this whole section is just a collection of fantastic and original Metroidvanias that are worth your time to play. And if you are a puzzle fan, and specifically if you think about building a more elevated or evolved take on a puzzle format, then this is an easy must-play to study. Time loop stories are all the rage these days, and there are definitely a variety of them in the indie space. But there is only one that I've played that makes use of this in a Metroidvania style, and that is Vision Soft Reset. Here you have quite literally 30 minutes in order to save the world. During that time, you must explore, figure out what and where are the essential upgrades, and chart your path to get everything that you need and get to the final area. The challenge of Vision Soft Reset is that when you're starting, you quite literally don't know where anything is. And you need to build up both kind of map and player knowledge along with the permanent upgrades. There are different kinds of upgrades in the Vision Soft Reset. There are some that are kind of only available during that specific run, such as health upgrades and that kind of stuff. And then you have the permanent upgrades that once they are unlocked, they are there persistent across each play. And you need to figure out how much of the kind of temporary upgrades you need to kind of combine that with the permanent ones. Different areas will change accordingly based on the overall time you're in. So an area may be only accessible from like minute 5 to minute 12 of the actual play. So you're kind of figuring things out all along, continuing with the upgrades and the progression. Now, with that said, the one issue I have with this game, and this is something I spoke to the developer about, was that they quite literally ran out of time and funding to kind of give this game the explosive finale that I think it deserved. So once you kind of solve the quote-unquote perfect loop, it is just kind of like one final boss to end it. But I really love this concept as a Metroidvania, and definitely recommend this one if you're looking for, yet again, another example of doing something differently and unique with Metroidvania design. We talked about upgrades earlier, but I want to talk more about the design of them, because the upgrades are going to be your bread and butter when it comes to your Metroidvania, and they need to be both well done and inventive if you want someone to keep playing your game. The footage you're seeing is of course from Axiom Verge, and we'll be talking more about what makes this game so impressive as a Metroidvania later in this video. But for right now, when it comes to great upgrade design, as we've been saying, you want every upgrade to feel legitimately different, and then by extension, the level design grows and changes with it. Axiom Verge features some very memorable upgrades. from phasing through the walls, the grapple, and so on and so forth. And what you don't want to do, and what will be coming up in our next example, is the upgrades either not being impactful enough, or they introduce something that just makes the game feel worse to play. And while that may sound like a very odd thing, it can happen if you're not careful with the balance of these systems and how the level designs are going to be built off of them. Now, our next example is not a bad Metroidvania, despite the fact that I'm putting it in the don't column here, and that is Leica Age Through Blood. This is a unusual and unique Metroidvania, as this is a motorcycle-avania. And what this game does is it builds all of its upgrades around ways of manipulating the bike or allowing you to manipulate yourself in the air and fight. So to wit, instead of getting just a double jump or a speed racer style spring in your bike, your shotgun propels you in the opposite direction due to the knockback. So if you aim it on the ground, it will propel you up. If you aim at a diagonal, it will also do that. And this enables you to essentially give your motorcycle the power of jumping, which on paper is great. The issue that I have with it, and why the game is in the negative column here, is that the upgrade itself is very janky to use. And this is one of the risks you run into with any Metroidvania or any kind of unique or original upgrade. How does it fit and feel in the player's hands? The issue is that the shotgun works by completely sapping or removing all your momentum and velocity and replacing it with the shotgun. So if I am driving at full speed and I press or I aim the shotgun down and I shoot it, it doesn't propel you forward. It propels you straight up. All your forward momentum that you build with your bike is gone. The only way to basically jump diagonally is you need to be aiming at the bike perfectly or your shotgun perfectly at a diagonal in the opposite direction that you're going in order to clear the gap. This gets very frustrating to do, as you're going to be doing this in a lot of sections where there are death pits. And a death pit means you return back to the previous checkpoint or you lose progress. And to compound the frustration, you see in Leica, you can't just shoot your gun infinitely. In order to reload, you must do a kind of 360 spin in the air, only in the air, to reload the currently equipped weapon. So every time you mess up the shotgun jump and you live, well, you're going to have to do a flip somewhere to reload it, and then go back and try it again. And if you mess that up, rinse and repeat. This is one of the risks you run into with Metroidvania design, that you don't want to introduce something that may be considered an upgrade and may be something cool and powerful, but if it makes the game harder or frustrating in a way that the player is not a fan of, it can easily ruin your game's chances and create a lot of churn. When you're trying to build an upgrade, look at how it integrates into the rest of the movement tech. You don't want to introduce an upgrade that supersedes or removes the player's ability to move or function prior. You don't want to introduce a downgrade unless it is a very specific style of Metroidvania. If you give the player a new jump, and that jump is frustrating to do, or it just is very limited in its approach, the player is going to feel like the game is cheating them, that it's getting worse to play instead of better. And you need to be aware of how these things feel. Once again, it's why playtesting is so important to any game out there, especially one when you're trying to motivate the player to progress through more and more upgrades. Since we're on the subject of upgrades, it's time to talk about another risk and challenge of Metroidvania design. Metroidvanias, like any game, can take a long time to develop, and with the idea that you're building a great game and then layering the Metroidvania elements on top, this can lead to games becoming far more complicated to develop, balance and playtests compared to some of the other genres that we've talked about, and some that will come up later in the series. So, what can end up happening is if you have a good game, but the Metroidvania elements aren't working or aren't good enough, it can lead to your title just feeling like it's dragging on, or it becomes more of an average experience. And in many ways, an average game can be worse than a bad one, because a bad game can at least be memorable in the player's minds. Games that are just average tend to just fade into memory, and we never think about them ever again. And the two examples I want to talk about both share not only the similar issue, but they also are some of the longest in development Metroidvanias that we've seen, and they are, of course, Owlboy and Iconoclast. And I want to stop here for a second and say that I would not classify either one of these games as being bad in any way, but the Metroidvania design doesn't quite stick out enough in either one. Owlboy was in development for, I believe it was about 10 years on and off. Iconoclast was 7 or 8, if I remember right off the top of my head. And when we play these games, they are really solid action design, really solid platforming and movement tech, but they don't feel like amazing Metroidvanias. They feel more like a standard 2D action adventure game, and maybe a little bit of Metroidvania here and there. But you see, the point that we've talked about in this video is that good Metroidvania design pushes the player forward. That allure of what is next, what new ability, what new power, what new thing that will change how I play the game. When we talk about lesser examples of Metroidvania design, upgrades are either very few and far in between, or the upgrades you get just aren't really kind of reverberating out into the game space. Giving the player the ability to break down green doors, or shoot bigger robots, doesn't give you new movement tech. It arguably may not even give you new combat tech if it's just you being able to hurt a new enemy. And both Owlboy and Iconoclast feature very few upgrades that legitimately change the way you play. We spent, I think, like 4 to 5 hours in Iconoclast, and I honestly cannot remember what upgrades we got, other than I think the ability to like grapple to like a specific point. There was nothing in terms of new movement tech that was added, and you see this creates a reverberation effect, because if you're not introducing new upgrades, it means the level design cannot grow and change. So the player is just doing the same thing from beginning to end, fighting the same enemies the same way, moving through the levels the same way. It just becomes more of a drag than an engaging experience. And like I said, neither game has bad gameplay to them, but when you're pitching a title as a Metroidvania, when you're trying to build the exploration into the level design, the progression, the player needs to be suitably rewarded. And it can't just be stuff that adds breadth, it has to add depth. A new shotgun blast doesn't change anything. If that shotgun blast, again, like with Leica, allows you to double jump, or your dash lets you, build up increased momentum for stronger attacks, these are things that change the player's experience, and it changes through the beginning to the end. If your game doesn't have that, you're going to end up with a title that just, again, it feels like you're doing the same exact thing. And it's because of that I have to put these games in the don't column. Because like I said, this is a video on Metroidvania design first and foremost. We're not getting into, action design 201, or how to do, shmups or fighting games or stealth or anything like that. This is specifically about the Metroidvania systems and progression curve. And when those get messed up, it can lead, again, to this game just unfortunately not working out and not keeping the player retained. With that, let's go to a kind of medium pick. Not exactly a don't do or a do don't. And that is 9 Years of Shadows. this was a Metroidvania that we played that it looks gorgeous. I love the use of color in this one, especially the portrait art. And I'm mentioning it here because this is perhaps the most, I think, straightforward example of a Metroidvania. It doesn't rock the boat in any way. Nothing sticks out as being horrible. Nothing sticks out as being above and beyond. It kind of like perfectly threads the needle to hit all the marks of a Metroidvania. Unlike our previous two examples, you do get interesting movement tech and upgrades in the form of kind of your different elemental powers. Each elemental power gives you a way of attacking, as well as a way of moving through the environment. Where the game kind of falls into this like perfectly average space is that the level design is kind of kept to be very much a one-shot. This is not a game that's really about backtracking for the most part. You should be able to get through every upgrade on every secret in each area on your first go-around with a few exceptions. The level design kind of goes for a circular approach, where every level kind of begins and ends in the same spot. You're going to go around, get a major upgrade, find the boss, defeat it, and then kind of return the way you came. And like I said, this one hits all these marks at like their best points, but it doesn't quite do enough, I feel, to stand out. It's also perhaps one of the shortest Metroidvanias that will be listed in this video. I think this one comes at maybe, I think it was like 5 to 6 hours, maybe a little bit more than that to get through. So I would look at this game if you're kind of wanting to understand the absolute basic blueprint to Metroidvania design. But if you want to compete in the market today, this is just the foundation. You have to go further. You've probably noticed on this list that we didn't really cover a lot of 3D Metroidvanias up until now, and that's because 3D is its own unique beast, and it's also a whole lot harder to make Metroidvania work in the third dimension. And yet we got one of the best examples and an easy must-play and follow with Pseudo-Regalia. The stories of this started out as part of a Metroidvania game jam, and with its release it has exploded into popularity among casual, core, and speedrunner fans alike. What this game does exceptionally well is capture the movement focus Metroidvania into 3D. This is something that is usually reserved in terms of advanced movement tech for like a Mario game or Demon's Turf from a few years ago, where you have multiple jumps, multiple ways of maneuver around the environment that can be combined at your leisure in order to do different things. And what Pseudo-Regalia does is take that level of great jumping and movement tech and turn it into a Metroidvania. You'll start with just a basic run and jump. You'll unlock the ability to attack, and then do more jumping, wall running, wall jumping, kick, wall jump, slide, and so on. And the game leaves it up to you to kind of explore in the space outside of just telling you like the basic maneuvers of these abilities. But once you start chaining things together, it leads to one of the more enjoyable 3D takes on 3D platforming, as you are given just an entire sandbox of platforming obstacles and environments to maneuver around, secrets to find, sequences to break, and so on. If there was like any like knock against this game, is that it just kind of like ends. There's a final boss, and then it just kind of like, it doesn't really feel like, I think, a solid of a resolution compared to some of the games we've played. Nevertheless, this is a phenomenal Metroidvania, and also an amazing example of 3D movement and design. And as I said at the start of the section, just definitely play this one if you have any interest in making a 3D based platformer, 3D based movement tech, just anything in 3D that involves movement. We mentioned Castlevania, we mentioned Metroid at the beginning, but we haven't really mentioned too much of modern Metroid. So our next due goes to Metroid Dread. With this one, what I really like about this from like a study perspective, this is perhaps the leanest Metroidvania I think that I've ever seen. And what I mean by that, there is just no fat to this game. There's no time loss having to hunt around for where you need to go. Nothing that kind of stops you from making progression. Everything is laid out very nice and neat for the player. It is such a 180 compared to a lot of the indie and exploration focused Metroidvanias where you get an upgrade and you have no idea where you're supposed to go, what it's supposed to be used for, and you're just supposed to mental wander around for a few hours to find the one clue, or the one note, or the one door, platform, lever, whatever that you need to use it on. Here, the main path through guides the player just so easily. As a good example of this, there are times where the player is forced to backtrack to a previous world or a previous biome in the game. So normally this will require the player to find a fast travel station, hunt around for where they need to go, do backtracking to get back to the spot they need, and then of course go back to that same fast travel, go back to the previous area, use a new power. Here, the game is timed so perfectly that the developers just say, okay, you reached the point where you need to go back to your previous area. Look, there's a teleporter right nearby. It takes you almost roughly to the spot that you need to go back to. And that becomes a new section for the player to explore, and when that's finished, they take the teleporter right back to where they were originally, and the new upgrade or thing that was unlocked is now used to move forward. The game also is, of course, very combat-centric, and I do like the kind of parry-based combat that you have on top of the shooting, missiling, and super bombing and so on. This is perhaps the first Metroid game I've played in a long time, maybe outside of the Metroid Prime series, where the boss fights felt legitimately good and different to do. There is skill involved in fighting them, especially the game's final boss, which takes this game probably the closest to being like a Souls-like in terms of how challenging that final boss was. What you should be studying with this one is how you can make your Metroidvania very lean. Now, that does come with some downsides, of course. For, if we were talking about, a Loopavania, or a game that's more exploration-focused, where it is more about hunting down what you're supposed to be doing, where things are, this kind of design would not work. But it does make Metroid Dread very approachable for anyone to get into. There is very little chance that you are going to get outright lost or confused about what you should be doing in this one. And the fact that it's probably one of the few Metroidvanias that having fast travel or the necessity of fast travel is very much downplayed, because you don't need to have instant fast travel or doing like that, because everything is just going to be laid out right in front of you. And is, again, on top of that being a fantastic action-adventure, great platforming, great movement, etc., etc. So, again, I gotta tip my hat to the developers, especially when we were playing this coinciding with me going back to Loopavania, and a game that is very different in terms of how you're supposed to explore it. So, an easy recommendation, and definitely one, again, where the pacing and the progression are just so finely tuned. Over the course of this video, we've talked a lot about movement-centric Metroidvanias, and how having an original and very well-tuned sense of movement and motion can elevate any game, especially Metroidvania. Our next example is another one that does just that, with Rusted Moss. What we have here is a game that goes with kind of grapple, bungee cord style physics that is used for combat, movement, and sequence breaking all here and there and all around. The game itself focuses more on range-based combat, but the kind of major element of this one is using your kind of bungee cord spirit in order to launch yourself around platforming, obstacles, and to collect the myriad of goods and upgrades. What I like about this one, again, is that the movement is incredibly solid and 100% original. As far as Metroidvania design goes, I would put this on the lower end of the scale. And this is something, again, that we see from a lot of games that have a very unique or like esoteric system that kind of is the bedrock for it. There's only so much you can do in terms of obstacle design when the player can just grapple all around, other than going like super kaizo, very masochistic levels of obstacle design. This is another one like Supravania that's definitely worth studying for how movement can be integrated into exploration and progression. While there aren't as many kind of movement tech upgrades in this one compared to Pseudo and some of the other ones that we played or talked about in this video, it is still a great example of how you can do different things with an original mechanic and build the world around it, while you're still going to be swinging and bouncing around from beginning to end. The challenges that go with it, especially some of the later boss fights, can become quite demanding and really requires you to understand how this ability works. The time trial or kind of climb yourself up like a huge steep area were incredibly fun, and again, it rewards the player for understanding how this all works. And it is a very easy recommendation, another game that I want to go back to at some point. We've mentioned a lot of popular and kind of hidden gem examples of Metroidvania design in this video. What were some of your favorites and ones that we missed? Let me know in the comments down below. But there are still a few very notable names that I haven't discussed yet, and one of them belongs to the Soulsvania style with Salt and Sanctuary. Part of the reason why I wanted to write this book on Metroidvania design, besides playing so many examples, is that what makes Metroidvania design so endearing is that the very best case examples of it really can become studio-defining titles, and that's what Salt and Sanctuary did for Ska Studios. They were making previous like smaller like action-based games in their original style, but Soul and Sanctuary is a game that blew up for them. It is also the first example of someone translating the kind of Souls-like flow and combat system to 2D. And while there have been plenty of games that have come after that have done similar or gone their own unique style of a Soulsvania, this is the one that kind of started it all. So what you're getting here is a game that manages to combine the very challenging and slower pace or deliberate combat system of a Souls-like with that of the progression, the upgrades, and so on of a Metroidvania, and then that is also tied into the RPG-based upgrades and progression. This is one that definitely hits a lot of different points with its design, and that's what makes it so unique in the space. You can't play this game purely as a Souls-like. You need to get really good at platforming and using the different movement tech and abilities. But you can't play this as a platformer because, well, you're going to be doing a lot of combat. And again, just from a Metroidvania standpoint, there are the additional elements of finding and equipping new gear, upgrading your massive perk tree, upgrading your gear, and so on and so forth. This one is definitely on the challenging side. And it's still, I think, kind of up in the air, even to this day, as to did this game really hit every point perfectly? And I found that the combat did get a little bit repetitive in the back half of it. Like a lot of the Souls-likes and high action-based games, there's that point that you will reach that you've either figured out the systems and progression, now you're just destroying everything, or it's not clicking and you're going to get your butt handed to you. And other than those damn unicorns that cause so much trouble, the game becomes relatively easy, but you do have to, I think, approaches more from the platforming side first, because the back half is full of a lot of lovely death pits and traps, or getting hit by an enemy and flung into a pit somewhere. What you'll get out of studying this one is marrying more advanced combat design with that of the Metroidvania systems. Now, this one is not as technical or movement focused as some of our earlier ones. It couldn't be, because then there will just be too many things going on at once. Super complicated combat, with, Kaizo level platforming, with CRPG levels of progression, it would just be too overwhelming. This is still a fantastic game, and while the sequel didn't hold up as well, this one is still phenomenal to check out for more of an advanced take on all these elements. Since we covered Soulsvania, it's only proper that we take a look at the rogue side next, with two fantastic examples with the roguelike and the roguelite variety. We're going to start with the roguelite, since it came first with Rogue Legacy and its sequel Rogue Legacy 2. So with these two, we have a first case example of a roguelite Metroidvania. And again, you'll know the difference between the two. Roguelikes are focusing on runs with any unlocks still resetting the player back to 0 at the start. Roguelites have the persistence that carries over from run to run. And Rogue Legacy, or both games, really cemented the foundation for this kind of design. That over the course of a run, you're going to be picking up a resource or resources that act as your meta currency. That meta currency can be spent after a run, win, lose, or draw, to further enhance your characters, unlock something new, boost something else. And some of these games let you kind of stockpile that resource, infinitely. Other games may have it that once you return back to the hub, you must spend it or lose it before you go to the next case. And that, I think there's pros and cons to both. I like kind of having that limit, but it also means that for people who are struggling, you'll reach that point where you're not earning enough resources to kind of make any more headway with progression, but at the same time, you can't go further because you're struggling with the game. Rogue Legacies both offer just a tremendous amount of persistence and progression. The sequel expands on this further with additional artifacts, and of course all these zany modifiers and family traits. What's interesting about the series is that there are cases or elements of bullet hell, with just the sheer ferocity that can be sent your way. Now, when you're studying this one, this is both a good example again of having different movement tech and movement abilities, but also building the roguelite side. That you have kind of the temporary or basic upgrades, stats, passives, etc., alongside the major ones, the ones that unlock new movement tech, new functionality, which is then used to progress further through the game. Like our next example, the world design is probably the weakest point of it, just because once you've played enough of it, you're going to pick up exactly where things are, what to do, etc., etc. But it's still a great series, especially with having the Ascension mode / progressive difficulty of letting you just keep playing it more and more. So, if you are looking to study a roguelite, and you want those Metroidvania aspects thrown in, this is an easy recommendation. Now, at this point, you're probably expecting me to talk a lot about Dead Cells as a Metroidvania with roguelike and arguably roguelite aspects to it. But it's not my favorite in terms of the combination. And our next due goes to a robot named Fight. What this game does really well is figuring out how to essentially do a Metroidvania randomizer before these were really blowing up in popularity among speedrunners and modders, such as with Axiom Verge, that their randomizer would come several years later. With a robot named Fight, this is a roguelike through and through. You'll start a run, you'll run through the different zones, collect your power-ups, fight the bosses, and hopefully win. But what the game does is that all the major progression upgrades, the ones that are used to introduce new movement tech or any kind of tech in general, those are randomly chosen on a run-by-run basis. And this is something that we haven't really seen, at least to this level, in any other kind of roguelike or roguelite Metroidvania. With the Rogue Legacy example from the last point, your upgrades are still tied to linear areas. That so-and-so is going to be in Area 1, Area 2, and repeat until you get to the end. In this game, yes, you're going to get some kind of movement power. But what that movement power is up in the air. You could get a kind of the morph ball. You could get a slide. You could get air dashing, jetpacking, infinite jumps, gravity jumps, all kinds of jumps. And it's up to you, much like with any roguelike and roguelite example, to somehow stitch together a winning run through all these different powers and upgrades. Now, the game is still a bit limited in terms of the level design itself. Once you've played enough runs, much like with the Binding of Isaac and any other roguelike example, you'll start to figure out just how the world is built. There's only so many room combinations, so many ways you can hide stuff in each area, that you'll kind of build that mental map. But this is still a phenomenal take on this formula. And if you have any interest in kind of the randomizer aspect of making a Metroidvania game, this is a great case study, alongside with Axiom Verge when that was added in. But I really want to see someone else kind of go forward with this kind of template, having multiple different ways of moving through a level, and then giving the player different kind of categories of each. So again, one run may be all about double jumping, missile launching, and sliding. Another run could be about jetpack, flamethrower, super laser. And once again, like with some of the best examples of roguelike design, there really is no cap to what can happen. Do you want to get the mega laser with the penta shot, with the triple shot, with the destructo shot, and just create death with each button push? You can do that. And this is the kind of stuff that, again, leads to some of the better aspects of roguelike and roguelike design that is arguably out of topic for this already long video. But again, if you have any interest in how the world can be built around different Metroidvania aspects and using different upgrades to accomplish the same task. So if you're trying to get past an obstacle, you could use an air dash, you could use morph ball, slide, shrink, teleport, whatever, and how these can be fit into a single game but not get all given to the player at one time, then this is a very easy recommendation. A lot of the Metroidvanias we've talked about in this video have been on the longer side, 8 to 10 hours plus at minimum. And it's very easy to think that a Metroidvania must be a lengthy experience. You have to fill with all the levels, all the rooms, upgrades, jumps on top of jumps, and more jumps. But you can do Metroidvania in a short or shortened design. And our next due goes to Alruna and the Necro-Industrialists. This was a Metroidvania that came out in 2024, where you are trying to stop the evils of techno-capitalism from destroying the land. And you play as kind of a flower or like plant dyad that is trying to do so. This is by no means a long game. I believe we clocked in maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to get through this one. But what you get with Alruna is a very condensed and very dense Metroidvania, built a lot around sequence breaking, making use of your abilities in interesting ways and combinations, and just moving through it as quickly and as effortlessly as possible. This one, I would say, it's kind of a jack of all trades and master of none. You will be doing some fighting, but nothing too big. Movement is going to be a few basic tech, but nowhere near the same levels as some of the other games. And with exploration, you're always given an idea of where you need to go and a full map to explore and all that good stuff. It is a game that wants you to try and go for 100%, and you'll be given enough clues and things to do just that. So what I want you to focus on with this one is a game that does not waste the player's time. It does not have space for the sake of space. It is a very good comparison to Metroid Dread in that respect. As I said earlier in this video, is another very lean Metroidvania. Now, Alruna does not come anywhere close to the same levels of depth, and it wasn't designed to do that. So this is a good one to study again if you want to make a Metroidvania and you're not interested in focusing on one that's going to take hours upon hours of the player's time. Another one for the do column is Axiom Verge, and like a lot of the games mentioned in this video, this is a game that really elevated the studio and developer when it came out, and again shows how much goes into making a Metroidvania with these different cores, and an original world and art style or art design to boot. With this one, while it does have very similar tells or cues from Metroid, you're going to be running and shooting and all that, you'll also find a variety of different weapons, and all of them focus on different styles of range, from rapid fire, laser, flamethrower, heavy shots, quick shots, all the shots in the world. And this is again built on top of having a variety of movement based and exploration style upgrades. Being able to use your grapple, your dash, phase through walls, the entire act being able to hack things that can change their properties. Another thing to study with Axiom Verge is that this is the only Metroidvania up until this point, not counting like a hack or mod, to get a dedicated randomizer mode. If you're not familiar with a randomizer, the world and level design does not change, but all the essential and non-essential items and upgrades are shuffled around. So you're kind of forced to adapt to which items you have, which will infer on which areas you can go to, which bosses you can fight, and it generally makes the early to mid-game of a Metroidvania far more interesting and far more challenging. There are Kaizo mods for many Metroidvanias out there, most notably Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But Axiom Verge is the first kind of released Metroidvania to get a randomizer approved or kind of given the stamp of approval by the developer. And if you're not familiar with randomizers and their appeal, this is a great Metroidvania to study on top of that if you aren't willing to like dive into mods and hacks for games. So another all-around solid Metroidvania that's worth studying that again keeps with these three cores. The movement is very interesting and varied. Combat is of course important with the different weapons. It does get a bit trickier, I would say, near the end, especially some of the more annoying enemy types. And of course you're going to be exploring the strange alien world, trying to figure out what is going on. So again, fantastic game and certainly one worth your time. In a strange twist, taking so long to get this video out has given me another example for the Don't column with Gal Guardian's Servants of the Dark. Now this is the full-blown Metroidvania version or sequel to the first game, which is more of a stage-based style. Now, this is one that the issue with this one doesn't present itself at the start. The controls are very solid, all the maneuvering and different tech feel great in your hands. The unusual problem with this one is how they handle progression. You see, you do get your different upgrades. You get a double jump, you get a triple jump. Under the right circumstances, you get a quadruple jump. But you see, instead of giving this to the player at specific points and setting up the world design and pacing for it, instead, all your upgrades are essentially tied to RNG. You're searching for mystical bones that you must bring back to your master's castle in order to turn into leveling up. This is the only way that you can improve your base stats, including your health and damage. At certain milestones, you will unlock a permanent upgrade, and this includes all the different Metroidvania movement tech. The issue is that what you get in terms of drops is entirely RNG. There are a few fixed bones that come with specific boss fights, but the bulk of your upgrades are going to come from enemy drops. But if you don't get those enemy drops, guess what? You're not going to get the upgrades. And if you don't get the upgrades at the point that you need them, you are just stuck. There's nothing you can do about it. If you get to an area where you must get or have double jump in order to proceed, and you don't have that, you can't do anything else. You have to go grind the enemies. And this game features a very annoying backtracking system that costs you money to return to one of the game's very few checkpoints. You can fast travel back to the home base for free, but you need to get to these specific points. So you have backtracking, grinding, and RNG in a Metroidvania. So when I decided to just stop playing this game, we spent about 40 minutes to an hour completely lost. Like, where was I supposed to go? There was nothing around, there was no upgrades I could find, And as it turns out, the reason why I couldn't make any more progress was that I didn't have enough levels in order to unlock the next tech, which was required to move the story along. And that does not work for a Metroidvania. The level design is just very much about space for the sake of space, and there are plenty of room arrangements that actually repeat in this level. And as I've said earlier, you don't want to be repeating room segments as part of your level design in a Metroidvania. And what they should have done is tie the required upgrades to the boss fights. There are a few upgrades that are tied to boss fights, and I'm surprised they didn't do this more throughout this game, because it doesn't make sense to force the player to grind enemies when the enemy drops are randomized. We were playing this on the higher difficulty, which is supposed to give you better drops. I even had an item on to even give more better drops. I was still not getting easy access to these bones. And this is a very big problem. It's a complete break of the design. And the don't to follow here is that you must tie major progression points to the level design and the pacing of your game. Because if you don't do that, you end up with a title that just feels awkward. Some people will get incredibly lucky, they'll get bones very easily, they'll blaze through this and wonder what we were talking about. Someone else will just have horrible luck, and they'll be slowed down, and they may just spend a lot of time wandering around going, why can't I do anything? And it's entirely not their fault. RNG works best for stuff that is meant to be like a minor reward or something that enhances what you already have. But tying things that lock access to the game to it is just poor form, and ends up with this experience being more frustrating than it needs to be. I want to talk about another combat-focused Metroidvania, and that is Nine Souls. This is a game that kind of encapsulates a lot of the lessons and elements we've talked about in this video up until this point, especially with how much a great Metroidvania can elevate a studio's name. And with the developer Red Candle Games, their first game, or the game they made prior to this, was a very slow-driven survival horror title, not anywhere close to a action-heavy game that one could get. But the developer switched to Nine Souls' design, and it has become one of the best-selling games for them, and one of the highest-rated games from 2024. Now, like Guacamelee before it, this is another combat-focused Metroidvania, but where Guacamelee goes for more of an arena combat, more almost like a spectacle fighter rather than like a solid or a more ground-to-earth action game. Nine Souls definitely borrows elements from Sekiro in being more parry-focused. And there's another important thing to study with Nine Souls, not only being combat-centric, and that is making a parry, or the animations for parrying, seem good or feel good to the player. A major difference between 2D and 3D designs, and 3D, you're able to track a character's movement far easier. You can see the exact depth of how an arm swings, or a sword is being stabbed at you. And it's far easier to parry and respond to that. What happens in 2D is that either the developers don't have enough frames of animation, or what they'll do is that instead of having animation, they'll just use kind of keyframes. So it'll be like, enemy is in the swing or winding up animation, and then they're immediately in the sword swung, you've been hit keyframe. The problem is that it becomes very hard to gauge parrying. The reason why is that for anyone who's played an action game, you know how much the timing, or how short the timing is for parrying windows. It's oftentimes within tenths of a second. Now, some games that are far more lenient, they may go for like a half a second to 3/4 of a second of a parry. If you're making a very challenging game like with Nine Souls, they went with it being instantaneous. And studying this game is a good example of a more elevated combat system, not only for a Metroidvania, but for action design in general. The parrying feels good, The enemies are all designed to test your ability to read their patterns, especially the boss fights and most notably the final boss. For fans of stuff like the final boss of Sekiro, you will feel right at home with trying to learn those pairings or die to get through that fight. Now, on top of that, this game features a lot of exploration, a lot of movement tech. It's not as movement focused as some of the other Metroidvanias on this list. Yes, you will get double jump, you will get air dashing, but it doesn't quite reach the same levels of challenge and level design as some of the other ones. And again, it didn't need to do that considering how much focus there is on combat. As you study this one, take note of how it feels to fight in 2D. Especially the ease in which you can see those animations. Very few 2D games, let alone Metroidvanias, do a great job of showing like the flow of an animation. And it takes a lot of skill to get this right. Because if you don't do it, you'll need to come up with a workaround, such as having a sound tell, or again, lengthening the parrying window for the character. So this one, again, really solid Metroidvania all around, but it is on the harder side, and that is probably one of the more damning things from critics of this one. That there really is no alternate path. In a game like Soul Sanctuary or some of the other like Souls-like designs we've talked about in previous design videos, you have options. If you're not good with swords, use magic. If you're not good with magic, use range. Use summons. Use something to get around these fights. Nine Souls is not that game. You need to know how to parry. If you do not learn that, you will not be able to get through this game at all. And again, the Sekiro comparison is very apt here. I'm curious, for those of you who have gone through Nine Souls, what did you think about in terms of its parry and just general combat design? And whether or not it clicked for you or it didn't. Either way, another really standout game that's worth studying for anyone who wants to do a lot more punching or stabbing or pipe smoking in their Metroidvania design. Once again, this video took so long to be made that I had to edit it to add additional games to this list. And our next due is for Zexion. Easily one of the finest Metroidvanias we've seen in 2025, and could easily go down as one of the all-time greats once more word gets out about it. What this game does really well is it evolves the shooter-based format of Metroidvanias, again made famous by the Super Metroids and their like. So you'll be running and gunning and using missiles as we all come to know. But what this game does phenomenally well is to integrate combat, exploration, and upgrades to a state that we really haven't seen other Metroidvanias get to. You once again will get access to different upgrades that will change how you move around each level. And these will allow you to do sequence breaks if you learn how to make use of them. You'll find, of course, more health, more weapon types, and you'll be given a very wide berth in this one. Similar to that of Hollow Knight, the world outside of a few specific upgrades is very much explorable in any and all directions. And of course, the order that you go in will greatly affect the difficulty and what you're able to do at any one point. As you go through this one, you're going to find that this is far more combat-centric compared to Metroid. The footage that you're seeing, of course, this looks very much like a NES-style Metroidvania. But where this game goes with its mechanics and its combat can really be seen with its boss designs. These are easily some of the most advanced and challenging bosses we've seen out of a Metroidvania. This is not a game about having fixed pattern fights. Every enemy has fully random patterns. They will track you like a heat-seeking missile, and you will work for every single victory in this game. And this is another example of Metroidvania that has a built-in randomizer, this one right from the get-go. And given the variety of weapons and of course variety of bosses to fight, it really is going to be a challenge to get through it. This one has been in development for a very long time, and it definitely shows with the level of craft, challenge, and just like kind of technical and design mastery present here. What you're going to get out of studying this one is, again, getting kind of like the apex of a Metroidvania themed game. You'll see how combat can really change based on different moves and different abilities, and definitely a lesson in boss design. That you don't need to just design bosses as elaborate puzzle fights or very basic patterns. You can give them a lot of different attacks, and you can make it a workout to fight them. If there's any issue that I have with this one that may need to be considered for those of you watching this, I'm not a fan of how rapidly enemies spawn in. The fact that the second you leave a room and you come back in, they're all back, can be very frustrating when it comes to backtracking, with most minor and smaller class enemies not even dropping any resources. When I talk about how different games can be aimed at different audiences, Zexion is 100% an example of a Metroidvania aimed for hardcore Metroidvania fans. And that is something that is very important to consider whenever you are designing a game regardless of your genre. The things that Zexion does or assumes of the player is that it's basing its design and its difficulty on someone who has played all the Metroidvanias, pretty much everyone that we've mentioned on this list in some capacity. And because of that, it doesn't really do a lot in terms of like affording, like, I guess like a grace period in terms of learning this game. Once you get past like the very, very quick beginning, the game basically stops pulling its punches and is going to test you on everything. So if you are someone who's looking for one of the finest examples of Metroidvania design, especially when it comes to range-based combat and boss design, this is an easy recommendation to check out. There's a lot of interesting Metroidvania designs as we've covered in this video, but there's one game that does things very uniquely, and that is the Supravania series. This, at times, is a first-person shooter. Maybe it's a physics puzzle game. Maybe it's action-adventure. Maybe it's all the above or none of the above all at once. This is one of the most advanced takes on Metroidvania designs that I've seen, bar none. What this game does is that it drops you in a world where everything has a different function or use to it. Each new power you get has at minimum 2 to 3 different use cases that will be figured for puzzle solving, for exploration, movement, and of course combat. There is a bevy of passive upgrades, almost in line with that of an idle game in terms of this kind of incremental sense of upgrades. You get 1 more point of damage, 1 more point of health, maybe you can move a little bit faster. And then there are the monumental upgrades that will become a part of all puzzle solving and many exploration tech going forward. One of the more standout ones is your kind of like magnetic power that lets you attach to any metal or metallic item. On paper, you can use this to move metallic objects, but you can also use this to move up and down any metallic surface, allowing you to basically wall climb your way around. But you can also reverse the polarity and send yourself careening off of it like a cannonball. And you will be making use of all of these abilities in order to solve the myriad puzzles. This is another very large and very secret heavy Metroidvania series. At times, the level design almost embodies that of an adventure game, where you go into a new area and there is at least 3 to 5 different mini puzzles all scattered around. Each one of those puzzles will have an item or something that will then guide you to solving the larger puzzle of the area. And you're going to have to figure out how you do all of this within each space. While there is combat in this game and there are a few boss fights, this is not combat focused, despite the fact that you do again run around like shooting enemies and hitting them with a sword. That just feels more like an afterthought in a sense compared to all the moving and puzzle solving you're going to do. Unlike La Mulana, the puzzles here are kept within the use of the tools and the in-world logic. This is not going to be one where you're going to be required to keep notes of all the hints and all the like secret tidbits that you need to then use in another area. It goes more in line with platforming or movement. I'm here. there's something over there. How do I get myself over there using whatever strange abilities and items in the environment that are nearby? And there is just a huge variety of level design in this one. Each one of these games feels like it could be like multiple Metroidvanias in one, given the sheer variety of tech and how these level designs grow and change accordingly. This is not an easy Metroidvania by any stretch of the imagination, and studying this one, you're going to see advanced Metroidvania design, not only in terms of creating innovative and interesting levels, but creating incredibly powerful and varied tools. That again, it's not just about using them for one specific solution, but almost kind of verging into immersive sim territory with, here's something really cool, and you can use it in so many different ways. Figure out how you're going to make do with it. So, an easy recommendation for me, and you've slept on Supravania if you haven't heard of it, you really need to check this one out if you just want to see how far Metroidvania design has come and where it can go if you really focus on the advanced tech. Before we get to our final pairing for this video, I have one more do that I want to discuss. Earlier in this video, I brought up Axiom Verge as one of the first Metroidvanias to kind of formally adopt a kind of mod or kind of a third-party form of gameplay, and that one was the randomizer. For our next do, I'm going to talk about a game that adopted reverse boss order into its mechanics and design, and that goes to the fantastic and challenging Unsighted. Unsighted is a combat-focused Metroidvania. You have a power, you have dodge, you have lots of enemies with a lot of combat patterns to focus on. But unlike the other ones that we've discussed, this one is done in kind of a 3/4 style or isometric perspective, similar to that of a game like Hyper Light Drifter. What Unsighted did really well was integrate different ways of movement and abilities that can be kind of traded in or replaced in order to make progress. And as I said at kind of the beginning of this section, it is the only Metroidvania to my mind that formally adopted a reverse boss order design. If you're not familiar with that style of play, this is something that we see from a lot of speedrunners of popular Metroidvanias. The idea is that, well, you will fight every boss in reverse order, meaning that you need to fight them in an order that is definitely not what the developers intended. That means using glitches or other methods to get the necessary upgrades to fight them, and then work your way from end to beginning. It is, as you can probably guess, noticeably harder at the start compared to some of the other ways of playing a Metroidvania design. Now, what Unsighted did was it is built into its achievements. There is an achievement to beat this game in reverse order. And how the game works is similar to that of Super Metroid. You have different movement tech and movement techniques you can use. You have a jump, you can kind of like wall jump up walls. You can use your attack to kind of give yourself a little bit more distance. And outside of very specific abilities, such as the option to grind rails, a lot of the tech you get introduced to allows you to kind of circumvent multiple challenges. So it's not a case of I must use upgrade A to get past obstacle A, B to B, and so on. And this allows the player to do things in reverse order. Now, the other major challenge of this being combat focused is that of course you're fighting bosses way above your pay grade at the beginning. But with the game's parry system and being able to do like reposes and counterattacks, a skilled enough player can certainly make up for it. And why it is a fantastic example in that respect. Now, if you are interested in studying this one, you're going to see another take on the combat-centric design, but with a good mix of, again, movement. And as I've said throughout this video, the best examples of movement tech and movement-based abilities afford the player multiple ways of getting around. That okay, if I can time this jump to a shot, it pushes me a little bit further. Or I can use this to give myself a little extra height and make like a pseudo double jump or a pseudo air dash. And again, not everyone is going to play your game for reverse boss order, for randomizers, and that kind of thing. But it's having this tech available that will allow you to make stronger and more varied level designs, and it offers that kind of incentive to really dig into the game. As a minor, not exactly a don't, but just something to keep an eye on, Uncited's original design was to force the player to deal with a timer, that at certain time intervals, characters will die. And if you don't keep them alive, they are gone for the rest of the playthrough. It was extremely stressful for people who don't like that kind of rush focus. And the developer kind of spelled it out right in the beginning that you don't have to worry about, or you can turn off that feature. And just something to keep in mind about when you throw time limits or time-sensitive content into games like this, especially if it's a very reflex-driven game where the player can lose a lot of time just trying to learn, okay, how do I move? How do I jump? That kind of thing. Still, another amazing example, and one that is definitely worth to be studied for, again, adopting what we normally don't consider to be a popular way or a mainstream way of playing into its design. For our last game to discuss, it should be one that comes to no surprise for anyone who's somewhat familiar with the Metroidvania genre, and that is Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight, as a Metroidvania, was kind of the banner game that I talked about in my upcoming Metroidvania design book, and it was arguably the biggest Metroidvania of the past decade. In terms of sales, it kind of dwarfed everything else combined just by that one game. From a design standpoint, as I've talked throughout this video, when we look at kind of the core pillars of Metroidvania gameplay, combat, exploration, and the actual like movement and platforming and that kind of thing, Hollow Knight does all three. And it does all three pretty much at the same time. And this is something that we really don't see from a lot of Metroidvanias. We really didn't see it from Metroidvanias up until the success of Hollow Knight. The game handles beautifully. Looking up interviews, the developers were apparently inspired by the likes of Mega Man X in terms of using kind of instant controls, dashing both on ground and on the air, and making it feel as responsive as possible. From a combat standpoint, Hollow Knight is the one that really brought not so much like a hardcore focus of combat like we saw with Guacamelee or later with Nine Souls, but a game that emphasized the player fighting a variety of enemies. There are a lot of bosses in this game, even more so if you go after the God challenges and especially the post-game DLC stuff that was added in. It is a game that demands that you learn how to make use of sword or nail and spell in order to survive. And of course, we cannot talk about Hollow Knight without mentioning just the sheer amount of exploration. This is a very dense world to explore. Many people who've played this one have gone over 100% in order to find every single thing in it. And with these three pillars all happening at the same time, Hollow Knight just really stood above everyone else. It is a Metroidvania that, just as we've said throughout this video, it elevates every aspect of its design. You could have made a Hollow Knight style game only focusing on the platforming, or the exploration, or the combat, and it would have been a good game. But Hollow Knight's kind of perfect triangular approach does so much to make it stand above and beyond the other Metroidvanias that we've talked about. Studying this one, you are going to get just the, Rolls Royce of Metroidvania design. You have the different movement tech. You have level design that is layered through that tech. You have a variety of enemies. You have many different places to explore. And one thing that Hollow Knight does that I've yet to see another Metroidvania do, maybe the closest would be Ori, would be to really integrate movement tech into the level design. This is when we start talking about the differences between a good or great Metroidvania and a masterclass example of it. With Hollow Knight, as you move forward in the game, the level design will grow and adapt based on what tech is available and which tech the player has access to. And many games will simply just use this to gate where the player can go. Oh, you won't go to the section that requires wall jumping, will require, a wall jumping obstacle at the beginning and nothing more beyond that. With Hollow Knight, the level design becomes more and more challenging and involved, as anyone who's done the Path of Pain and White Palace can attest to. I loved the Path of Pain in Hollow Knight. I felt it was a really great challenge of these mechanics and design. Another thing that we haven't really discussed yet is just how much Metroidvania design has become inspired by Hollow Knight since its release. The changing of healing to a kind of push forward element using your soul to heal. Hollow Knight was, I believe, the first Metroidvania to do something along those lines, and has since been copied by everyone. Having pogo bouncing, or the pogo jump, become now like a staple has been another thing that we've seen more people do, even though we could argue that the earlier indie game Shovel Knight used pogo jumping first in terms of that kind of tech. With that said, Hollow Knight is a game that deserves all the praise that people have said, and if you have any, and I do mean any, interest in studying the appeal of Metroidvania design, how combat, movement, and exploration can be taken to their absolute best, or at least their most refined, this is just another fantastic example and one immediately worth studying. And before I forget, another first from Hollow Knight was the whole use of the trinket customization system that would then go on to be used by plenty of Metroidvanias. Now, with that said, it is important, as I always say in these design pieces, that if your takeaway from this section is just copy Hollow Knight and your Metroidvania will succeed, that is the wrong lesson. Hollow Knight is a great example of how these systems work, and that's what you should be studying, but again, you need to be able to create something original out of this. So with that, we have one more don't for this video, and I shudder to think who is going to follow up the amazing Hollow Knight for this piece. For our final don't, we turn to one of the worst Metroidvanias out there, and that is Hollow Knight. Just a disgustingly bad game where I can't imagine any smart or reasonable person would have enjoyed such a horrible trash fire of a Metroidvania. Clearly one of the worst received examples of the 2010s. Now, as we wait for the pitchforks and torches to arrive, I guess I should elaborate on that. Hollow Knight, as I said in our last section, was one of the most celebrated Metroidvanias. It is the one that so many Metroidvanias following have adapted or borrowed elements of it since its release. But that does not make it a perfect game. And it's important to discuss some of the major pain points and issues with Hollow Knight, because if you try to put them into your game, you are not going to be making anywhere close to Hollow Knight numbers, as we again have seen with these sales results. When we check the achievement rates for Hollow Knight on Steam, and compare this to the Steam Spy or the estimated sales, Hollow Knight earned a lot of sales just on Steam. I don't have the data to look at on the consoles. When we check the achievement page on Steam, the churn rate tells a very different tale. 39% of the player base never got past Hornet. That is about 30 to 50 minutes of game time. 44.8% of everyone who played this game on Steam is the amount of people who beat the Soul Master, which that is kind of the end of the intro of Hollow Knight. That means about 55.2% of the people who played Hollow Knight never even made it to the point where they got access to a double jump. And these are some very sharp declines in Hollow Knight's play rate among the consumers. Now, according to the page, in terms of actually beating the game, which that is kind of important, the basic achievement goes to 22.2%. And that, I would say, is somewhat reasonable, but we cannot excuse just how much Hollow Knight rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in terms of its play style. And it's important to discuss, again, why pain points do matter, and what they mean if you want to improve or iterate on a design. So while I definitely loved Hollow Knight, again, the people who played Hollow Knight all the way through from beginning to end will easily say it's one of their favorite games of all time, especially one of their favorite Metroidvanias. It does have some very annoying points from the beginning. This is a good example of another game that punishes the player for losing. This is something that, when we saw the evolution of Souls-like design, from Demon Souls to Dark and to Elden Ring, that From Software has been doing a lot more to remove any long-term or even mid-term punishments of dying. Yes, you lose your resource. Okay, that's bad, but you can recoup that by killing more enemies. In Hollow Knight, when you die, not only do you drop all your currency on the ground, but your kind of soul flask becomes cracked, meaning that you have less soul in order to heal or use spells. The game becomes harder under the punishment of dying. And this is something that time and time again, people do not like that kind of punishment. They don't mind, being sent back to a checkpoint, having to restart a level, or do a boss fight again. But when you tell them that they're now 2-3 steps behind, or worse than they were a minute ago, that does frustrate a lot of people. And more importantly, it's a frustration that only impacts those who are trying to learn the game. For every expert Hollow Knight player watching this, can you remember the last time a common mob in the game actually managed to kill you? For the lesser players, they probably remember that quite often. And it leads to a lot of frustration. The map system in Hollow Knight is one that, even from the get-go, I was not a fan of. That you tie your ability to view your position on the map to having to require a trinket on at all times. And the trinket system is one of the most elaborate of this style of Metroidvania, but it's also one of the more cumbersome ones. Because you have different builds relating to different play styles, it can become a little bit of a nightmare to try and remember, okay, which trinket goes with this one? Let me take this on, let me put this one on. And it would have been nice to have the ability to set up templates. So I just hit a button, and if I want the slashing trinket build, I get that. If I want the spell trinkets, I get that, and so on. And it's that kind of constant fussing around between trinkets that can become very annoying for players. It is a game, as I said, where the exploration is one of the major selling points, but it's also one of the biggest detriments for new players. It is very hard on your first time through Hollow Knight to have any idea where you're going. Even with the beginning being somewhat railroaded, you're still going to have to dig in order to find the right path and the upgrades that are going to be required. Once you get past the city for the first time, then the game just basically throws up its hands and say, go wherever you want. Do it. Go. Be free. But Metroidvania design is about, again, a pseudo-open world. Yes, you can go everywhere. The game doesn't tell you that you must be level 3 before you get to level 4, but it's still railroaded based on the upgrades that are available. For anyone who's played Hollow Knight, you know that the second you finish the city, you need to go down and get double jump, because so many areas are going to require that. And if you go the wrong way, not only are you going to be in for a world of hurt, but you're going to get lost, and you're going to have no idea where you should be going or what you should be doing. With some of the other Metroidvanias that we've played, one example being Ender Magnolia, that one had a similar issue in terms of exploration. In it, you can quite literally fast travel any which way that you want, which is great. But it created no sense of pacing to world exploration. Okay, I go to one corner of the map, then I go to the other corner of the map, then go to the northeast, then remember there was a path southwest. And if you don't remember that, then good luck trying to play the game. And Hollow Knight, like a lot of the other exploration-focused games, this is not a game that you can play once a week, once every 4 to 5 days, because you are going to forget everything. And then good luck trying to remember where you've been, where you need to go, what upgrade you're trying to get to. As another important point about Hollow Knight, and this is something that is very distinctive about Metroidvania design with the 3 cores. When we talk about movement, exploration, and combat, the more that you throw at the player in this respect, it does not earn you more fans. Because again, people love to come with very easy answers. Just add more levels, add more gun, add more jump, and that will lead to more people playing your game. But the more that you require the player to learn in order to master your game, it will limit the audience. Hollow Knight is not a Metroidvania for platforming fans. It's not a Metroidvania for exploration fans or for combat fans. It's a Metroidvania for people who want to do platforming while heavy exploring and doing a lot of combat. And that subsection of a subsection of a subsection is a far more hardcore, but still a niche audience. And I'm wondering, with how long Hollow Knight has been in development for and so on, what are they doing, if anything, to try and alleviate some of these pain points? Because I'm sure at this point, developers know that a lot of people didn't play the game all the way through. They've heard people being frustrated by it. And how will they kind of square that circle with Silksong? Because, as I've said plenty of times over, just because one game does amazingly well, even if it is a massive success like Hollow Knight, does not automatically guarantee that the sequel will do anywhere near as well, especially if it's making the same mistakes or only appealing to the specific audience that managed to beat Hollow Knight. And that is a very stinging point for everyone watching this to understand. Just because Hollow Knight had millions of sales on Steam, again, not adding in the other platforms, that does not mean that in terms of the actual audience or the guaranteed audience for Silksong is going to be anywhere near that number of people who bought the game. And it's a tale as old as time for developers misunderstanding who their audience is and double, tripling, or quadrupling down on a game to only find that there is just no audience, or the audience is nowhere near the size that was required to make this game a success. Now, as this video has been going on for what seems like 8 years now, there's a good chance that Silksong will be officially confirmed just as this video goes up. But I am definitely going to be keeping multiple eyes on how Silksong will do, especially compared to Hollow Knight. And as I said at the start of the section, while Hollow Knight is a great game, it is also far more niche in terms of its audience and appeal than its sales may illustrate. And as a developer, you need to understand this because, again, the issues that Hollow Knight has, they are not going to be ignored in your version or your interpretation of that specific design. And it's why I always say, when you want to study a game, you need to understand what it did right and what elements could have hurt the game or did hurt the game in the eyes of the player base. When I began doing this video 87 years ago, I didn't think it would take this long to finish this video on Metroidvanias. Surprisingly, I was kind of expecting Silksong to be announced, released, and reviewed by the time this video went up, so at least this came out before Silksong. Make sure everyone notes that when in the history books. So, after everything said, Metroidvania design is one of the harder aspects to get right, because it is kind of a genre that you layer on top of the genre of choice. As we talk about with all the many examples, how you approach things through either exploration, combat, or movement tech, or all the above, will greatly affect the reach and the market for your game. And anything that you put in that doesn't quite work, or if any one of those three are misaligned, it will lead to the entire game not working right. Because if it's not enjoyable to move around or explore, that's kind of the whole point. And combat being required or not can still become very annoying to do. So, if I somehow missed it, or some of your favorite Metroidvanias of 1, 2, 3, or all the above when it comes to their design, any unusual takes as well that booked these trends, because we've been seeing, at least very lately, these kinds of rumors and smaller titles have been doing very interesting things. We mentioned Pseudo-Regalia at some point in this massive video, but I'm sure there are plenty others out there that are going to be even more interesting and original in the future. And if you're not tired of me ranting and raving about Metroidvania design and want to know even more about it, my latest game design deep dive on Metroidvanias is out now, and you'll find a lovely little image of it right there, and a link down below. So, thank you so much for watching. If you somehow made it through this entire video, and if you have a suggestion for our next deep dive, hopefully one that won't take 2 hours or more to cover, let me know. Well, with that, I'm going to go sleep now, and see everyone for our next, and hopefully shorter, video. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoyed the video, do the YouTubing stuff, be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and if you're interested in more in my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.